Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of State of Mind. This will be part 24, the second half to chapter 16. For hours and hours, Izuku refused to give away One for All. No matter what they did to him, he stood tall. The leader of the League of Villains, All for One, didn't do any of the hard work himself, allowing the ones called Toga and Dabi to hurt him, taking turns. Toga herself wasn't too bad. Izuku could handle her. He understood the pain of knives. It was just metal, cutting and slicing and stabbing, and he understood Toga's craziness. With her, it was a ritual. All for One would ask him to give him One for All, and he would refuse, and Toga would cut him. It was fine. Izuku stood tall. But then Dabi switched out with Toga with his fire, and Izuku broke. Even if he'd wanted to, he would have been unable to give All for One for All. Pretty soon after Dabi set him on fire with his fire, Izuku was gone, lost in his own mind, completely nonverbal and unresponsive. He could distantly feel what was going on to his body, but he couldn't respond. He recognized it as a severe form of disassociation, and he welcomed it, letting it take him away. Eventually, they seemed to realize they weren't even getting cries of pain out of him anymore, and All for One left angrily while Dabi and Toga untied him, leaving the cuffs on, and told him to get up. When he didn't, Dabi picked him up surprisingly carefully in his own bandaged arms and carried him down a dank and dark hallway to his cell and dropped him bodily against a hard ground, crouching beside him with his back to the camera in the corner. "I didn't want to have to hurt you," he said, turquoise eyes looking down at Izuku. "I don't know about all this business between you and the boss, but why don't you just give him what he wants?" Izuku didn't answer, and Dabi sighed after a moment of watching him, straightening up. He looked as if he was going to say something, but then shook his head and left, locking the heavy metal door behind him. Izuku laid there for an unknown amount of time before slowly returning to himself. His feet twitched first, and then his breathing and heart rate picked up as the pain of his wounds began to register again. Izuku tried to calm his racing heart and take calculated stock of his body. Broken ribs from the villain trying to kill Kota, probable concussion along with a large head wound, hidden under blood-matted hair from the same event. He also had a splitting headache and exhaustion from previous overuse of his quirk. What even happened? He could barely remember. Many first-degree burns, as well as several second-degree burns, multiple lacerations and cuts from Toga, plus whatever All for One's weird black tendrils had done. There were no stab wounds from them, but there were deep purple and blue bruises where they had impacted him. That seemed to be all that was wrong with him that he could find for the time being. It was plenty, though, and the cold seeping into his bones from the cement floor did nothing to help, his trembling only causing his injuries to hurt more. His hands were still cuffed behind his back, and when he tugged on them, he noted the distinct feeling of something in his flesh, and assumed he was wearing quirk-suppressing cuffs, making him essentially quirkless. Again. He wondered if they were giving him anything else through the needles embedded in his skin, and really hoped that wasn't the case. Taking into account his disorientation from his head wounds and all the other pain he was in, Izuku didn't think he would be able to even tell if they were drugging him with something. Izuku forced himself to sit up to keep as little of his body against the cold cement as possible. He pulled his legs to his chest and laid his forehead against them, shivering uncontrollably, teeth chattering. He was tired, and he was hurting, scared, and lonely. He hoped all the other students were okay that had been there that night. He wondered what Shoto was doing, if he was worried about him, and if anyone had told Izuku's mom what had happened. He wondered what Aizawa and Mike were doing about the situation, if they were looking for him. Izuku wondered if anyone even cared, if anyone was going to come for him at all, if he was worth it. Izuku tried to stop that line of thinking as quickly as possible. He had people that cared for him now. Of course they were going to come for him. The heroes would come. He just had to keep thinking that. Izuku was strong, and he had been getting stronger. He just had to hold out for the heroes to come and take him away. And with that line of thought, Izuku began to worry even more. This was All for One, after all, the person that had dealt Yagi that horrible wound that had taken so many of his organs. Even the #1 hero, All Might, wasn't much of a contender by himself. How could anyone rescue him when such powerful people were keeping him? Izuku, alone in the dark of the cell, allowed himself to cry silent tears, face hidden against his legs, and he wondered why these things happened to him. He allowed himself this brief moment of self-pity. They gathered at Shoto's bedside, and he stared at his bandaged leg as Kirishima explained his plan, as if it took that much to convince Shoto to go. They didn't realize Shoto had already agreed to go the second Kirishima had mentioned even having a plan in the first place. Shoto had lain in the hospital bed for over a day, replaying everything that had happened that night over and over again, in a twisted repeat in his head as his hand clutched angrily at his bed sheets, knuckles white. His only injury was his leg, with third-degree burns, but Recovery Girl and a couple skin grafts had it nearly better. He could walk. He was sure he could run if need be. Shoto would be there for Izuku no matter what. He was done sitting around while his first and best friends suffered. They would meet when night fell, and they would go to Kamino. They wouldn't get in the way. They would do what they could do to find Izuku and then get out. Ida was against it, but Shoto honestly didn't give a shit, ignoring him for the most part. Ida didn't understand how Shoto felt. He hadn't seen it. Izuku's fear and panic. He didn't know what Izuku had already gone through. Even Shoto didn't know the extent of it all. Izuku didn't deserve this. No one deserved this, but... Shoto pushed his face into his hands when Kirishima finally left. He couldn't stop seeing it. He couldn't stop imagining what Izuku could possibly be going through right at this very second, as he laid on a soft bed, gentle beams of light coming in through an open window. Shoto had never felt so useless in his entire life, and he needed the feeling to go away. He needed to help Izuku. He needed to do something. Shoto went to talk to Yaoyorozu later that afternoon and found her reluctant to act and seemingly unsure of what to do. It didn't matter, though. Shoto would go. He had the right city, and he knew his father was doing something that night in Kamino. What else could it be besides an attack on the League? Shoto would follow him if he had to. When he had first met Izuku, Shoto hadn't thought anything of it. He hadn't thought that Izuku would end up being so much like him, and that he would end up being his first and closest friend. He had never felt so protective and friendly toward a person in his life, and it was jarring, and most of the time he didn't know how to deal with the feelings. But now, he knew what he would have to do to act and to help. Even if he didn't end up getting anything done when he went, at least he tried. That mattered. Living a life of small kindnesses being rare and far between, Shoto knew the importance of someone just trying to help, of someone just willing to be there. They met that night in front of the hospital. Shoto's leg was heavily bandaged beneath his black pants, and he was on painkillers. He could still feel the pain of the burn, but he could move, and that's what mattered. All he needed to do was to be able to move. It was only Kirishima and Shoto at first, as they waited on Yaoyorozu. He refused to wait for long, though. He was ready to get his friend, to go. Surprisingly, though, it was Bakugo that joined them first, walking out of the shadows with his hands shoved into his pockets and a volatile expression on his face. "Why are you here?" Shoto had to restrain the urge to snarl at him. "I'm not letting that damn nerd almost die because of me again," Bakugo growled beneath his breath, almost too low for them to hear. Again. Shoto noted that as important information about Izuku for later. "Do you even care?" Shoto didn't want him here. He didn't want someone he had seen cause his friend such anxiety to be there when they rescued him. Bakugo went to answer, his face twisting, but Kirishima interrupted, walking forward to wrap a friendly arm around Bakugo's shoulders. "Glad you're here to help, buddy. Now we just need—" "I'm here," a voice said, and they all turned to see Yaoyorozu walking up to them from the hospital exit entrance, a serious expression on her face. Shoto squared his shoulders and lifted his chin. It didn't matter what she had decided on. "Yaoyorozu, what's your answer?" Kirishima released Bakugo and took a step forward, eyes wide. "Wait!" another voice said as Ida walked up, his features twisted in a dismayed manner. "Why did it have to be you, of all people?" He was looking right at Shoto. Shoto couldn't do it anymore. He turned around and started walking away. "Wait, Todoroki, what are you doing?" Kirishima yelled. Shoto turned, eyes narrowed. heat gathering along his left side.
Izuku could be dying. He could be suffering and hurt and alone while you four have some sort of a drama scene. I've waited long enough on you to make up your minds on a decision that should be easy. Shoto looked over at Ida and spat out. And you. Grow up. This isn't about you, and it's nothing like what you did. We are not going out of revenge. We are going to rescue our classmate and our friend. We're supposed to be heroes, and you're all acting like a bunch of infants. Everyone was frozen, gawking at Shoto, whom they had all barely heard speak at all, let alone this much at one time. Shoto looked over all of them, both eyes cold and steely, before turning on his heel and walking away. Kirishima and Bakugo were the first to catch up. The other two followed quickly after sharing a strained look between the two of them. All for One wasn't there the next time they brought him out of the cell, which was a bit of a relief, or as much of a relief as Izuku could get in a place like this. Izuku had managed to get a little sleep, but in the end, the pain had woken him up. He knew he should also be hungry after going so long without consuming anything, but he wasn't, at all. And Izuku knew that it was because of his emotional state, but he couldn't bring himself to be worried about it. Spinner had come and brought him water and crackers at one point, telling him that he disagreed with what they were doing to him, not that it helped. He still didn't try to stop it when Dabi used his fire on him again later, telling him to, "Just give in, kid." Izuku never would. He only wished he could disassociate again. The fire made him feel like he was rupturing from the inside out as his flesh burned and his eyes watered. Izuku still didn't give in when Shigaraki eventually joined their torture session, as much as he was scared of the man, his fingers trailing along the new scar he'd placed on his throat at the mall. Shigaraki was talking, but behind him, there was suddenly the sound of Aizawa's voice, and Izuku froze, trying to hear the sound of the comforting, familiar voice over everything else that was going on. "Handyman, would you shut up? I'm trying to listen," he growled. Shigaraki hit him, but it had been worth it to see his pissed-off face. Izuku could get under his skin so easily. It was like speaking with a child. Shigaraki turned to look at the television, scowling beneath the hand covering his face, his hands at his sides. "It's so strange," he said. "Why are the heroes being criticized?" Izuku tried to breathe evenly, but he couldn't stop the tremors. The fire user, Dabi, was standing too close. The way they were dealing with things was just a little off the mark. Shigaraki stepped forward. "Is it because it's their job to protect? Either way, it doesn't matter. No one is coming for you. No one cares about you. The only reason you're still alive is because you have something Master wants. It's our job to get it, so let's begin, right, Master?" The TV in the back of the room gave an affirmative noise, and Shigaraki nodded to the girl behind the counter. "Toga." Toga made a sound of excitement, climbing over the bar and coming to stand in front of Izuku, twirling a knife around her fingers enthusiastically and practically vibrating with delight. "I'm back, Izuku," she grinned, displaying her sharp teeth. He hated his name in her mouth. He hated everything about it. She must have seen his disgusted expression because her grin brightened. "Don't worry, Izu." Yeah, that wasn't any better. "I'll take care of you." Toga pressed the tip of her blade against his forehead, pushing it down hard and drawing it through his flesh horizontally. "Head wounds bleed the most," she grinned gleefully. "It's so cute on you, Izu." Blood immediately began pouring down his face. At first, his eyebrows saved his vision, but too soon the blood collected and drained down over his eyes, covering his entire face in red and forcing him to close his eyes. "You are so cute, covered in blood." Knock, knock, knock. "This is Pizza La, Kamino store." Izuku started, turning his head toward where he'd heard the noise as blood dripped from his nose and chin, still flowing. She must have cut very deeply. The wall next to Izuku suddenly exploded, and despite being bolted to the ground, the force knocked him to the side, and his head bounced off the ground, a grunt escaping him. Just what he needed, another head wound. Kamui Wood soared in with his preemptive binding, lacquered chain prison technique. Izuku could hear ruckus and yelling, but he couldn't see. He struggled against the rope, tying him to the chair and the cuffs around his wrists, the needles digging into his flesh painfully. You can't run anymore, League of Villains. Why? Izuku stopped straining, panting heavily. It was All Might. Yagi had come for him. They'd come for him. Because we are here. Edge, a voice like Gran Torino's said, and then suddenly, someone was touching Izuku and he flinched into the back of the chair, still on his side. It's all right, I'm a hero, a gentle new voice said, and he felt a strange sensation on his wrists, the ropes untying and then the cuffs falling away, the needles ripping from his skin, then the ropes on his ankles dropped as well. As soon as he was free, Izuku shoved himself away from the chair and whoever was near him, scooting back on his butt until his back was against a wall, and then he wiped furiously at the blood covering his eyes. He looked around quickly, with his restored vision, taking in the situation as quickly as possible. The hero Edge shot had left Izuku and was busy knocking the villains out. Gran Torino was keeping an eye on everything, and Kamui Woods was restraining them all skillfully. All Might approached Izuku, crouching down next to him, looking him over. Young Izuku, it's okay, we're here now. Izuku looked up into Yagi's familiar eyes, and he blinked more blood away as it gathered on his eyelashes. Yagi looked worried. His eyes were adeptly scanning Izuku's battered body. Years and years of experience running through his head of the dangers of certain wounds Izuku obviously had. My boy, you did a great job, you did so well. Yagi lifted a hand and Izuku panicked, jerking back, his head hitting the wall painfully when there was nowhere else to go. Hurt flashed in Yagi's eyes before he schooled his features and dropped his hand. I'm sorry I wasn't there for you, he said in a softer voice. Izuku shook his head, but Yagi turned, something that Izuku didn't hear catching the hero's attention. Where is he right now? All Might asked, and Izuku lifted his knees to his chest, shaking uncontrollably. He was talking about All for One. Of course Yagi was going to try to fight him. Izuku rubbed his wrists, his fingers glancing over the bruised pinpricks where the quirk-suppressing cuffs had been. How long would it take for his quirks to return? Go away, Shigaraki hissed. Disappear. I hate you. As if triggered by Shigaraki's words, a thick, viscous material had welled up in Izuku's throat, and he choked, hands going to his neck. The liquid burst forth from his mouth, and All Might turned back to him, eyes widening. Izuku struggled to breathe, gagging, his bloodshot eyes large and full of fear. This was just like that slime villain all over again. Young Izuku! All Might yelled, reaching forward. Izuku scrambled, his feet kicking against the floor as the gelatinous material had surrounded Izuku's whole form, drowning him until he was suddenly dropped to his hands and knees. Fuck, he gagged, spitting up bile and other nastiness. Give it to me now, All for One demanded, as soon as he landed, shooting off his black tendrils and slamming them into Izuku's body. Where the hell had he come from? Where was Izuku? Had he been teleported? No more playing around. Give it to me now, boy. No! Izuku screamed as he was lifted from the ground by the tendrils that were digging into his body. His hands yanked at them, trying to grasp their inky coldness fruitlessly. The tendrils only dug in harder, and a howl reverberated out of his chest. Now! All for One yelled, twisting and digging them in. Izuku's howl dropped into a choked scream as blackness encroached on his vision, and his muscles stopped obeying him. Master, let me help. Shigaraki crept forward. Izuku had almost completely forgotten about the other villains. They must have been teleported along with him. But where were they? Where was All Might? Was he going to find Izuku again? Izuku was on his own again, and that fact itself was near debilitating. You failed, Tomura. All for One's voice was more gentle when he looked next to Izuku, where Handyman was straightening. Do not be discouraged. You can try again, but not right now. None of you are needed at the moment. If I cannot get One for All now. He turned to Izuku then. I will get it later. Izuku was released, and he dropped to the ground in an unmoving heap, panting as he tried not to pass out. Before Izuku could do anything aside from just breathe, there was a reverberating roar of anger, and suddenly All Might slammed into All for One. The air pressure rolled Izuku across the ground until his back hit a chunk of rubble, and he gasped, laying on his side now until he flopped onto his back, his head turning slightly so that he could see All Might with All for One. "I will have you return everything," All Might yelled angrily, waves of air pressure still emanating from their fight, holding Izuku painfully against the rubble. "Will you kill me again, All Might?" All for One asked slyly, seemingly unconcerned about anything that was going on, about the prospect of fighting with All Might. Was he that confident? The air pressure stopped then, and Izuku tried to move as the two foes continued to speak. "Get up." His inner voice was screaming at him to move, to get up, to do something. "I won't make the same mistake that I did 6 years ago, All for One," All Might was saying. "I will take young Izuku back, and this time I will throw you in prison for sure, and all the League of Villains you control with you." All Might surged forward, and Izuku gritted his teeth. "Get up." There were too many people around, too many villains. He could even sense his... Izuku's eyes widened. He could sense again. All Might was shot backward into a building, and almost immediately, All for One turned to Shigaraki. "Run away, Tomura, and take that child with you." All for One gestured to Izuku, who was trying to force himself up onto shaking limbs, the feeling of One for All returning comfortably to settle into his body, similar to the feeling of chugging several energy drinks at once. The quirk suppressants had finally worn off. He climbed to his feet as All for One activated his black tendrils and shot them into Kurogiri's body. He was either forcibly activating Warp Gate, or he was taking his quirk. Once on his feet, finally, Izuku glared at All for One, panting. He was standing tall. A Warp Gate formed over Kurogiri just as All Might returned, coming from above. All for One lifted into the sky to meet the number one hero, and then... that was when the rest of the villains turned to face Izuku, prepared to drag him into the Warp Gate, no matter what it took. Izuku gasped as the weight of their eyes fell on him. His quirks were returning to full force now. He wasn't helpless, but Izuku knew that his body was running on pure adrenaline at the moment. It wouldn't take much to cause him to lose grasp of his consciousness. His best bet would be to avoid any fighting altogether and run. But how could he possibly do that? They were all staring right at him, all watching. Izuku tried to step back, but the end of his heel had connected with that stupid piece of rubble, and he couldn't move any further back. Izuku had to focus, but he could barely even form a thought at all. His options were severely limited by his broken and battered body, even with his returning quirks. There was a desperate pressure building in Izuku's head, begging to be let out. It felt dark and malicious, worse than the fire rain. If only Izuku could control that fire rain, this would be so much easier. Toga charged him first, and he barely dodged her original attack, the thrust of her knife scraping against his cheek, directly over the cut that she gave him to wake him up when he first came to at the bar with the villains, however long ago that was. Izuku didn't even feel it, disconnected from the pain, his nerve endings shot. At least Dabi wasn't here. That small miracle was probably the only reason Izuku could still stand. Izuku tried to focus as much as possible on that one part of his original quirk. He focused on the villains surrounding him, attacking him, hurting him, and how they had been hurting him for so long. Next, twice came at him, some sort of rope thing lashing out, slicing across Izuku's shoulder, blood flinging up in droplets. Izuku flicked his fingers and calculated shots toward twice, with One for All throwing the guy back. Toga returned, the same twisted grin spreading across her face, too wide and too sharp. Izuku leapt over her, flicking his fingers toward her, knocking her straight back into Twice, who had just been getting up. The pressure in Izuku's brain grew and grew, mounting and clawing to be let out, like demons at the gates of hell. Sensing someone coming from behind as he landed, Izuku dived to the side, his shoulder slamming against the ground as he flicked at the rapidly approaching Compress. Both Spinner and Magne advanced toward Izuku then, running at him. Izuku coughed blood onto the ground, swiping a leg out to trip Magne, and then springboarding backward from his inert position in a gymnastics move. Spinner looked at where he landed in surprise, no one expecting him to be able to move like that still. And Izuku really shouldn't be. He was sure he could literally feel his broken ribs grating together inside of his lungs with every movement. Izuku stilled, lifting his head toward the sky, his eyes burning as all the villains came at him at once. He had no choice anymore. Just as all the villains came close enough to reach him, Izuku clenched his hands into fists, gritted his teeth, and finally let some of the pressure on his head out, akin to a tiny hole in a hot air balloon, the smallest bit leaking out. Izuku tried to control whatever it was. He didn't have much of a choice anymore, even though he couldn't control it. It was do or die now, and Izuku would rather do than die. The shadows suddenly lengthened around Izuku. His eyes glowed red, his tangled hair lifted, his heart stuttered, and then the world exploded. Lava rain showered down as crevices opened up in the ground, separating the villains from Izuku. Plants grew out of the crevices and then died, grew and died, grew and died, all the while a steady hum that had started suddenly began building up into a demonic howling that got louder and louder, like the sound of 1,000,000 people screaming in agony at once, at max volume through a low-voice augmentator. Fire lighted anything nearby that was flammable, including the villains, who shrieked in agony before diving through the warp gate, one after another fleeing Izuku. One of them screamed that Izuku was a monster. Above Izuku, above even where the lava rain fell, All for One was suddenly engulfed in burning white fire, plummeting him to the ground. All Might landed next to him, the ground cracking, the area around him distorting from the closeness to the flames, his hair singeing, the lava rain close enough to be painful against his skin. Things were falling now amidst the rain, igniting as soon as they hit the air. Large things and small things that were completely indistinguishable, as they were consumed and melted by white fire immediately. Nothing but mush hitting the ground, and even that disappeared into the crevices. Izuku was not in control, and he knew the only thing keeping All for One alive was some heat-resistant quirk that still barely kept him from melting, bones and all. "Izuku, stop!" All Might yelled. Izuku couldn't. His mind was turning into a sieve, and it hurt. The shadows were overtaking everything. His eyes were leaking blood. He couldn't think. He couldn't move. "Izuku!" Another voice yelled, and he lifted his head as Shoto of all people rushed toward him, avoiding the breaches in the earth and the debris, the falling pieces of whatever they were. Shoto moved fast, practically sprinting now, and took Izuku into his arms, pulling him against his chest. "It's okay now, Izuku. It's fine. We've got you." Ida and Yaoyorozu were suddenly there, and Kirishima, and even Kachan, though he hung back as everyone embraced him. Even when his knees gave out, they followed him to the ground. Izuku had stood tall, but now he could sleep. Shoto held Izuku close as his head listed to the side, his eyes slowly closing. His best friend looked horrible. There was a horizontal gash across his forehead, clotted with blood, and a cut across his cheek. His eyes, still a sharp red, seemed hazy and distant. His breathing was a whistle, and his body was literally covered in more cuts, gashes, burns, slices, stab wounds, and bruises than Shoto could bear to look at. Even his eyebrows and eyelashes were clumped with blood. He looked like he should be dead. Shoto didn't know how he had managed to stand, let alone fight back against the villains. He was covered in so much blood, his clothes torn and dirty. His hair was matted and fell back over his shoulder, as Izuku finally seemed to pass out. The rain stopped abruptly, and the shadows returned to their normal existence, instead of writhing and growing like living things. The strange plants in the fissures had stopped doing their macabre dance of life and death. All the lava that had collected on the ground seeped into the chasms in the ground. The things on fire went out, the fire snuffed. The villain was left smoldering on the ground at All Might's feet, as he looked at him in bewilderment. The world seemed too quiet after the intense cacophony of sound that it had just been. "He needs a hospital," Ida suddenly exclaimed frantically, his fingers on Izuku's pulse point on his throat. Shoto laid Izuku's still form down, lifting his arms away, hoping that the position would ease the wheezing of his breath. He had heard and seen Izuku's fight with the villains from afar, had wanted to do something, but Ida had held him back, the murderous intent of the villain terrifying them all. None of them had been able to come up with a plan that wasn't just running in and helping Izuku fight, but Shoto was going to do it anyway. He didn't care. Izuku needed help, and some stupid law was not going to stop him. He had just broken free of Ida's grasp when the shadows suddenly grew, stretching out toward the students who all flinched, jumping out of the way, sensing something inherently wrong with whatever was going on. It darkened, the air felt heavier, and Shoto abruptly felt like he was holding up the world itself, the air pressing down on him, weighing him down. He felt inferior, hurting, a waste of space. Something was very wrong. And then it was like back at the training camp, except worse. The temperature shot up so far that Shoto exasperated his right side, trying to keep everyone cool, even as the heat in the air had seemed to be taking all the moisture out of his skin. Over the blockade they were hiding behind, Shoto caught sight of the lava rain, concentrated into a single area around the villains attacking Izuku, though the heat from it was igniting everything around them, except for the students, mercifully. The ground split open with deep cracks, as if the earth itself was breaking apart, and an ominous red light glowed from within them, even as some sort of gnarled tree grew and died over and over again from within them. Shoto couldn't help but think of a painting Fuyumi had taken him to see, called Pandemonium, by some guy in the 19th century. It had been a graphic depiction of hell. Izuku's quirk might possibly be the strongest thing Shoto had ever seen, but this feeling was wrong. It was as if Izuku was emanating every horrible emotion that existed, multiplied by 1,000,000. What the heck was it? Shoto had no idea what was going on, but when he looked over at his best friend, at his bleeding eyes and bloodied form, face twisted into a freeze frame of pain, he knew it needed to stop. So he broke free of Ida again and ran, leaping over chasms and dodging burning piles of random debris. The rain seemed to clear a way for him as he reached Izuku and threw his arms around him, tugging him close, telling him everything was okay now, that they had him, repeating it like a mantra. After that, things moved along quickly. The police and paramedics arrived. The one villain that was left was taken. All Might went in an ambulance with Izuku and Shoto, and his classmates were driven to the police station, forced to endure lectures, but weren't in any real trouble because they had not used their quirks. As soon as that was done, they all reached an unspoken agreement and headed to the hospital, which, fortunately, was not actually that far away. In his own hospital bed, Yagi considered the situation. He was running on the last vestiges of One for All. He could feel it disappearing rapidly, like a flickering flame. He had honestly thought that this fight was going to be the end of it for him, that the world was going to see his true form whether he liked it or not. He had pushed himself past his limit too much lately. It was only a matter of time. There wasn't much left of All Might in Yagi. He had a plan involving his retirement. He'd had it planned for a while. It seemed the time quickly approached in which he would have to act on that plan, but for now, his focus would be on making sure Izuku was okay. He couldn't stop thinking about how the boy had flinched away from him. He hadn't done that since their first month or so together. Yagi grabbed his phone from the bedside table and called Tsukauchi, getting the rundown of everything that had happened after he'd left, including sending the students home that had gone there despite their desire to check on their friend. He called Gran, and he called Aizawa, then he called the chief of police, and then he called Dave. After over 2 hours of calls, another checkup, and Aizawa and Mike coming into his room, Yagi asked to see the doctor in charge of Izuku, stating that he was Izuku's one and only emergency contact, and that Aizawa and Mike were currently Izuku's guardians. He dreaded hearing the damage his successor had attained, but he needed all the information that he could get. He had looked far from good in that ambulance, and to say that Yagi was concerned was like saying the sun was warm. Quite the understatement. Yagi worried about Izuku's mental state as well as his physical state, and he knew the boy would need all their help as soon as he woke up. He would need everyone to be there for him. All right, listeners, this concludes Chapter 16 of State of Mind. Chapter 17 will be up next. Let me know your thoughts and reactions to this chapter. Took a bit of a darker turn there. I like how this chapter was kind of split up, and that the first half really kind of centered around Izuku being kind of taken, and the second half really focuses on the turmoil that he faced while trapped with the League of Villains. So drop those comments and reactions below. I'd really like to hear what you all thought. And as always, thank you all so much for listening.